The lasting effect of the Tet Offensive uh, really just began the entire trauma of the entire year of 1968. You see, the Tet Offensive caught American intelligence and military forces by surprise. We were able to beat it back in most areas of Vietnam. You still had the siege at Khe Sanh that lasted all the way until March and into the early parts of April. President Johnson prioritized Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh will not fall. And so he would have daily briefings about the Khe Sanh siege and how things were going. Eventually, enough American firepower, bombing, all kinds of stuff, would win out the day. So even though 20,000 NVA soldiers surrounded about 6,000 Marines, you're ineffective when you have a waterfall of bombs being dropped on you. American firepower wins the day. Khe Sanh eventually is saved. Another major conflict occurs in the ancient Vietnamese capital at Hue, where the city was basically split in half by the North Vietnamese, and it would take several weeks for United States Marines to clear out the city of Hue, not without untold destruction of ancient figures and monuments and other buildings of sort. But eventually, Hue was liberated. The Tet Offensive caught Americans by surprise. We beat it back. Militarily, it was an utter defeat. The communists attacked and they were beaten back soundly within a matter of days in most places. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a gigantic defeat for the communists. Okay? However, from a psychological standpoint, they caught America off guard. They caught our intelligence and military off guard. And the media publications back home focused in and around the traumas of the Tet Offensive and how they caught American military commanders and intelligence off guard. They would see images of Khe Sanh every day. They would see what was going on at Hue every day. They saw the actual hole in the outer wall of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon that the VC had blown. The Tet Offensive was where America's military lost the war. And they lost it not necessarily militarily, they lost it from a psychological standpoint because the American people back home, instead of thinking you just destroyed a large aspect of communist forces, you were caught off guard. You lost the trust of the American society. And so, from a political standpoint, from a psychological standpoint, it was a massive victory for the communists. Yeah, they were beaten back soundly from a militaristic standpoint. They were utterly defeated. They won a psychological battle. They won over the American society, not in support of communism, but that perhaps our involvement in Vietnam wasn't necessary. We weren't going to win. So much so that CBS evening newscaster Walter Cronkite, America's newsman, the most reputable news name in media at the time, Walter Cronkite, he spent a couple weeks in Vietnam. During the Tet Offensive, he actually went to Hue City and he observed Marines in action. And he took tours all over Vietnam during that time. He came back in late February 1968. And on national television, he gave somewhat of an op-ed and spoke directly to the American people. And I'll include the video in the slide. Basically, Walter Cronkite says that through his observations and his report, the war in Vietnam is not winnable because we're not going to lose it militarily. We're not going to lose major battles or anything of the sort. But the steadfast commitment of our aggressor enemy is so vast that it's going to largely be unwinnable. They are going to take losses that we would deem as insurmountable, but not them. They're more focused than we are. What you're going to have is basically a stalemate. We have immense firepower, superior weaponry numbers. We don't have the home field. We don't have the commitment. We don't have the reason. So, yeah, we're defending South Vietnam from a communist takeover. North Vietnam has more motivation than that. They also have a significant amount of funding from the Soviet Union and from China itself. Okay? When Walter Cronkite makes that proclamation, the American public loses it. And it catches a lot of U.S. servicemen serving overseas off guard. When they hear that Cronkite's saying this, they thought they had actually won a war. They just defeated communist forces. They attacked us during Tet, and we beat them back. Didn't matter. Cronkite said that there's a stalemate. You lost public opinion right there. The Tet Offensive would set off the initial shocks that would become the entire year of 1968. Because more than just Vietnam, you had other things in 1968 that made that year somewhat apocalyptic. You had the Tet Offensive, the siege at Khe Sanh, Hue City, proclamations then and thereof. And then on April 4th, in Memphis, Tennessee, great civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was gunned down and assassinated. All the civil rights that had been enacted in the 60s, all the various different movements to bring black people into a better elevation for equality, all that was now put under question because the greatest civil rights leader in American history is dead. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination rocks the country. And it rocks the country as we are fresh off the Tet Offensive. Right about that time as well, President Johnson, who over the last few years had seen his popularity nosedive and take a severe hit when his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, resigns, and then his Tet Offensive taking everything by storm. Johnson and his commanders were telling things were going a certain way in Vietnam, and it seemed really, in reality, that they weren't going that well. Johnson's approval rating nosedives. He's got to run for re-election in 1968. And he sees some of the writing on the wall because critics within the Democratic Party itself are starting to criticize LBJ. He's a very unpopular figure. And even his fellow Democrats largely and loudly criticize him. And he may not actually win the Democratic nomination at the Democratic National Convention later that summer. So, roughly about the time, within a week or so of Martin Luther King's assassination, LBJ addresses the nation, gives a report on things that are happening overseas, and then he announces that he will not seek nor accept the nomination from the Democratic Party for president in the November 1968 election. He has a constitutional right to seek re-election under his other term. He bows out. He sees the writing on the wall. So it becomes common knowledge that LBJ will not be our president the following year. Okay. Other Democratic candidates emerge. Hubert Humphrey is one of them. Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the former President JFK, is a popular figure as he's Attorney General of the United States. Again, beautiful Kennedy family. He's a Kennedy, and he looks the part as well. And he has political clout because he served in his brother's and in LBJ's administration. Robert Kennedy becomes a very popular figure in the Democratic Party. It's thought that he very likely could be a frontrunner in the Democratic Party. He might win an election. He might be our next president. Bobby Kennedy. RFK, Robert F. Kennedy. Um, you have the trauma of the Tet Offensive. LBJ is going to bow out. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. And then in June 1968, RFK, Robert Kennedy, Bobby, is also assassinated. A presidential candidate, a Kennedy, whose brother was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in November 1963, is assassinated almost 5 years later. The potential frontrunner for the presidential nomination for the Democratic Party, assassinated. This further comes on the heels of the month of May in 1968 when over 2,100 American servicemen died in Vietnam. The deadliest month in our entire conflict in Vietnam, May 1968, over 2,100 American deaths. What you are seeing in 1968 is one major trauma after another, and it does not stop. And protests continue, and civil rights violence and protests also continue, riots in the streets, and it culminates in the summer of 1968 at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. The Democrats, oh boy, their president is bowing out because he's unpopular. Bobby Kennedy was killed. In the summer of 1968, the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago was not without a massive amount of controversy. The city of Chicago itself has its own political gamesmanship. The Chicago boss and alderman type approach to politics is drastically different than what you see elsewhere in the country. They didn't like many of the different things going on. There were a number of different riots that occurred in protest of the Democratic Party outside of the convention in Chicago. And Chicago was virtually in lockdown, under siege. Massive riots in the streets outside the Democratic National Convention, violence, police brutality, death, all kinds of different things. Apocalypse of 1968. In the meantime, all of these things going on, Richard Nixon, remember him? Former Vice President of the United States in the Eisenhower administration, lost an election to JFK in November 1960 in a very close election. He is the front runner for the Republican nomination for their party's candidate for president in 1968. And he has had 8 years to relay his message and to kind of learn from the wrongs of the 1960 election and relaying that into 1968 and capturing some of the misgivings of the Democratic Party and all of the things that are going on, the riots at their convention, RFK, the unpopularity of LBJ, all kinds of different things he is capitalizing on. And another thing he capitalizes on is that the Democratic Party is split. You see, there's a Southern candidate, George Wallace, former governor of Alabama, a known segregationist and avowed racist, makes no bones about that. He fought largely against segregating Alabama schools and even gave a famous speech at the University of Alabama proclaiming that discrimination and segregation should not happen. He defended that. He was a big Southern rights guy running as a Dixiecrat. He ran as an independent in 1968 and got 9 million votes, and he won several states across the South. And in doing so, Richard Nixon gained enough clout throughout the country. He ran on an idea of peacemaker. Not necessarily that we were going to end the war in Vietnam, but we're going to have more profound resolutions there. And we're going to do something about the inflation that has started to happen as well. He ran on those platforms, and the American public largely voted for him. and he won the 1968 election. He was inaugurated as president in January 1969, but that sort of culminates the year that 1968 was. The backdrop, the Tet Offensive, our further escalation of our involvement in Vietnam, the most traumatic year in Vietnam. So I mentioned how over 2,100 servicemen died in Vietnam in May alone of that year. Over the entire year 1968, 16,000 Americans died in Vietnam. You consider America's long involvement in Iraq, we lost about 5,000 U.S. servicemen. That's 5,000 too many, if you ask me. But otherwise, though, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the entire year of 1968. You had half as many die in 1 month in Vietnam than you did in our entire involvement in Iraq. That's how deadly our involvement in Vietnam was in 1968. Add to that Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, the riots and uncertainty and the violence and the deaths at the Democratic National Convention. 1968 was incredibly traumatic. It's apocalyptic in many different ways. My question to you would be, what would you consider more apocalyptic in the 1960s? The Cuban Missile Crisis of the fall of 1962? Or the entire traumas of 1968? You can research and discuss amongst yourselves. We were on the brink of a possible nuclear engagement with the Soviets in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And eventually, world leaders Khrushchev and Kennedy would have to stand down. 1968. Death, destruction, war, surprise, assassinations, violence. All while the massive war movement was continuing to build. 1968 was definitely a time and a sign of the apocalypse. If there ever was a year, that was it. So, ask yourself this as well. 2020. This is not a good year. We're not off to a good start this year. You know, I thought Kobe Bryant suddenly dying in a helicopter crash really set the year off on a bad tone. And then this whole coronavirus situation took place, and our economy is shut down. People are losing their lives. We are at home trying to quarantine so as not to spread this virus to which we don't have immunity yet. A lot of people are hurting. A lot of people are out of work. A lot of our healthcare folks are overworked. God bless them. They are true heroes trying to keep people alive. This is an apocalyptic year. But we've been through this before. The lesson for you to learn in and amongst the chaos of 2020 is that we have been here before. Traumas, signs of an apocalypse have been here before. We survived the Cuban Missile Crisis. We survived the traumas of 1968. We survived through the Great Depression in the 30s. We survived the World War II. We survived the financial crisis in 2008. We'll get through this. Our history in this country has proven that. We will overcome this if we stay steadfast and strong. We will survive this.